Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to start out with my presentation, and it is around mental training or expanding the cognitive domain and using a physical literacy journey to help explain that. But in our current times, mental imagery or mental training can be a really an extra tool that you could use to enhance your life and to enhance physical literacy and your teaching, just all aspects of your life. So I hope that the things that I present in the next few minutes can really help you out. So, so I'm going to start out with the reason that mental training or mental imagery is such a big part of what we can do or what we do. Um, all of us are made up of an invisible backpack. We have thoughts, we have experiences that make us who we are, but no one sees them. So as we go through life, we have an invisible backpack that is full of everything of who we've been along the journey, and that's really important because if you can figure that out or understand what that's about, it can enhance your life moving forward, or how you think about moving forward can be really really important. So just keep that in mind as I go through my presentation. And the first part about mental training or mental imagery in sport or physical activity or physical literacy is the concept of mindfulness. We have to really think. It's metacognition, right? We have to think about how we're thinking, and that is so important. So, why is mindfulness important? Because we need to be in the moment in order be to optimize ourselves and to get the most out of our physical ability, all of our abilities, to be honest. So mindfulness is really important. So I'll give you a concept of what mindfulness truly is. So I'm going to step back, and I'm going to use the concept of eternity, not from a religious context, but just the idea of infinity. So if it would be the number line in math, it goes on forever. So I know when I was a kid, I used to really struggle with the concept of eternity, like living forever. Like that just seems like a really difficult concept to understand. And but here's how it works. So if we're born on one hand, and we're at a certain stage in our life, and then if we think of eternity, that just moves on. That moves on for forever. And so along that continuum, no matter where we are, no matter what we believe, right now, right now we are in eternity, if we're along that continuum, if we can imagine that. So the goal in life is to live in the moment, and then that's ultimately, if you always focus on living in the moment, which is what mindfulness is, and really taking in everything around you, you have a great way of optimizing what you're doing in that moment. And that's sort of the beauty of mindfulness. So in terms of mental training, you need to come from that vantage point. So you have an invisible backpack, and you have this concept of mindfulness, living in the moment, in order to, because that's the only moment that's important. The other piece that we have to remember is no matter where we are in life, so we have birth to where we are right now in our lives along that journey, and it can be like a physical literacy journey as well. But we also know that there's a finite end. We have a mortality, right? In human lives, we know that there'll be a time and place when we won't be here. But here's the goal. The goal in terms of mental training or how we're thinking is we need to get from where we are now in our life to the end of our life as slowly as possible. That is huge. The whole goal is to be mindful. So get there, get to the end of our lives as slowly as possible, and that is going to maximize the experiences that we truly have and that we bring in. So that's a really important concept. The other time that talks about that. So if we want to get there as slowly as possible, it's also our quality time left. So we need to, if we can instill that in our kids, that when we're teaching and in anybody that we're working with, it's all about the quality time. And yeah, we have a finite time that's left, but if we can make that quality those quality experiences, that is huge. And that's a big part about, because what I'm going to talk about today is not just being here, not just being good. The advantages of using mental training is that it can give you another skill that can make you great. And the greats in life, not just in sport and not just in physical literacy, in all aspects, there's been something about the mental journey or the mindful journey that they've been on that has also made them great. So it's very interesting. It's another piece that makes, it's a holistic viewpoint, but it's another piece of our lives that sometimes undertapped, because we spend most of our time in physical education and sport doing physical training. So if we add mental training, that can really make a difference. So quality time left is really important. Good to great. All right. We want our kids, if they're truly mindful, to play the best that they can be in that moment all the time. If you practice that way, you have huge advantages to being great. If you don't practice that way, you may not reap the benefits of what your maximum potential could be. So during this time of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the stress that people are under, this using mindful training now, because we have to social distance and we're not around people as much. There's not team groups happening and so on. Mental training can really be a huge advantage for us right now. And hopefully, if we use that, then once we come out of this and things resume and we start playing again in larger groups, then there's an advantage that our mental training can enhance our fundamental movement skills and our strategic thinking in sport, that we can actually start to move forward and we can be better. So also, too, for those of you that are educators, remember that children are the living message that we send to a time we will not see. So those seeds that we're planting now are going to be fruitful in the future along that quality time left, and it's going to really make a difference for our kids. So that's a big way of thinking. So the other part to remember is where we're at right now, is that with our students, in order to slow that down, in order to be mindful of where we need to be, another thought process that you can have is that childhood is not a race. Every moment is so precious, so it's not a race. Childhood is also, if you're thinking at it from a physical education sport perspective, childhood is a short season. So we really want to make sure that it's a quality time for our students, and we can do that. We can do that if we're mindful about how we teach and how we can enhance the skills that our kids have, and that we enjoy those moments as they go through childhood. We can enjoy those with them, but that's really, really important. Remember, childhood's a short season. So mental imagery is using your mind, or mental training in a controlled way. It's a very specific way. And just like you practice with your fundamental movement skills, and you practice muscle memory and your muscles, you get stronger when you're exercising and so on, the same thing happens with your mind. If you are systematic and consistent in your training of your mind, it is like every other muscle, and it will respond to that training, and it can really make a difference, and it can enhance your life moving forward, the quality of your life and the experiences that you have physically. It can be huge. So remember, what you think is what you will become. So the more that you think that way, that's really important. And then I'll talk a little bit more about why we do that, and why thinking directs the way our lives go. So there's 3 types of mental imagery training that are out there. So here would be the first type, and it's one that we're all fairly familiar with, and it's motivational thinking. This would be when you go to if you ever get a chance to go to the Olympics, everybody competing in a certain event is thinking of winning the gold medal and standing on the podium with the medal around their neck and feeling really, really good at the end of the event. So motivational thinking would be winning the Stanley Cup. Every little hockey player, boy or girl, thinks about that. That would be the ultimate. Winning the Super Bowl, winning the Grey Cup, the ultimate event, winning a competition and feeling really, really good. Winning the U.S. Open would be huge, and we would be so that is motivational thinking. It's really, really important. So when a season starts, or when we're teaching skills to our kids or whatever, it's really good to have a sort of an ultimate thought around what that would be. But motivational thinking is just because you think you're going to win the gold medal, that's not going to be enough for you to win the gold medal. And I'll talk about goal setting and setting the stage for mental training as we move forward. So the second type of training, mental training, is I call it problem solving. This would be an opportunity where students or athletes would go through in their mind the mistakes that they're making, and then they would figure out through coaching or through themselves or through feedback with what they're doing in say their physical education classes or in sport, what they're doing wrong. And then they would go through in their mind doing it right. So reviewing, so finding a problem, but then starting to rework their brain, rewire how they think in terms of, and then moving it forward and then making those corrections in their mind. So during this time of the pandemic, if there's an area where a student or an athlete is struggling, that would be a good time to be thinking about, okay, here's where I'm struggling. Now I'm going to review in my mind all the time, very systematically and consistently, that I am improving or doing it properly. And that's where feedback from coaches, peers, yourself, that feedback then turns into, you can start to review. So maybe a situation in a skill that you're working on hasn't been going very well, but in your mind, you start to perform that skill perfectly. And then eventually, when you get back onto the court or wherever you're playing or performing your skills, then you can actually have a greater chance of correcting the mistakes and then performing properly physically. So problem solving is a big one. It also helps in terms of anxiety or other situations. If you're anxious about a competition, you can review how you would feel to not be anxious going into a competition. You'd feel confident instead of anxious. And so you can review situations that you would go into. Another great one is a job interview. You could review the positive aspects of that job interview before you ever go. Then when you go, you've got a blueprint in your mind as to how that would go successfully rather than a blueprint to how it would go negatively if you were just anxious and nervous and didn't feel prepared. So problem solving is the second one, and it's really, really good. So we have motivational and we have problem solving. The third one is performance. Now, performance imagery is where and that's what I'll talk about now next in terms of the skill or performing skills. And this would be huge in terms of fundamental movement skills and physical literacy. But this would be the process where you are imagining doing a skill perfectly in your mind. What happens is that your brain then sets down a blueprint, sends messages to your muscles that are correct. It would be the right pathways in order for you to perform those skills in the correct way. And performance training in your mind, mental imagery training around this area, then it's another strategy then that helps to maximize the potential that you would have physically performing that skill. So if those pathways are set down correctly, you'll perform this. The chances of you performing that skill correctly are really, really high. If your pathways are negative, it's very interesting, right? Because then ultimately you might keep performing that skill the wrong way. And again, this is where coaching and feedback, video feedback, can be huge, and it can come back and make a difference for people. So moving forward then, how would you make mental imagery training work in terms of increasing fundamental movement skills and physical literacy? Well, the biggest one is that you need to have a plan. You need to have a plan as an educator or coach, but your students and your athletes also have to have a plan. And the key is they have to write it out. If students write out their plan, that's consistent and systematic, they have a greater chance of doing it. Lots of people have a plan, but they haven't written it out. And when just the actual physical act of writing it out, that whole mental physical act of writing out what you want to do, enhances your chances of actually doing it. So make sure that the plan is written out and it's systematic. And what are students, what are you as an educator moving towards? And coach, where do you need to be? What are you teaching? And then what do you want your athletes and students to learn? Which is huge, right? They need to know where they're going and they need to have a plan to get there. So if you don't have a plan, mental imagery or cognitive training it's not hit and miss. You can't just lay on the couch the night before a big event and do some thinking about it, and then it's going to translate into a gold medal the next day. This is years, months of systematic, consistent mental training tied to physical training and other all holistic aspects, nutrition and so on, to make a difference in order for people to optimize their skills. So it's important. So what are the steps? What are the steps to mental training after you've written out the plan? Well, the first one is when you do mental training, you have to relax. You have to be in a position of where you're calm and focused and mindful of what you're going to be practicing. That is really important. So you can't be anxious. You can't have 25 other things in your mind and say, okay, now I'm going to just I'm going to do my mental training now. It doesn't work. It actually doesn't work for physical training either if you're too scattered. So that's not good. So you want to be relaxed. So sometimes when people do mental training, they'll spend time maybe laying down, focusing on their breathing, right? Doing lots of breathing, just slowing it down, focusing on just clearing their mind, and then they can go into the mental training piece. All right. So being relaxed before you start your mental training sessions is important. All right. Now remember, I keep using the terms consistent and systematic. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're training, and that's part of the plan. So if you were working, say 5 times a week, every second day maybe, on your training at a certain time for 30 minutes, that's really, really important is how you would set that up. So now, as you move forward in your thinking, this is to maximize it. So some people do their training while they're laying on a bed or a couch. They're very relaxed and they go through all of these steps that I'll talk about. And that's okay. That also works. That also sends the pathways, or the blueprint is established in your brain to do this properly. But the best way would be if you were in the position. So if I was a downhill skier, I would be in the position. And it's even better if you would be using that on the slope. So you'd be in the ready position in the starting gate, and then you would start to do your mental training. If I was shooting a basketball right before a set shot, Steph Curry, incredibly skilled at this. All right, so I would be in the position right before I shoot, and now I would do my mental training. So that is really important as to how I would. You need to be in that position. So for football, the quarterback would be ready. I'm in the ready position to throw, and now I would start to, in my mind, I would start to go through all of the progressions or the skills that I need to perform this skill of throwing the ball properly. So the next step is, so you're in the position, all right, okay, and then what you do is you imagine the movement in your mind, the complete perfect movement in your mind. So if I was in that throwing position, I would go through in my mind then what it would be to throw it. I would see myself throwing it. Now, our minds work in 2 ways. You can see it from your mind's eye, which would be out of your eyes, as if I'm looking at the screen right now and seeing myself performing it. Another one is I could see myself performing the skill as if I was on videotape, if I was on TV, right? So the best way to do mental training is to see it through your mind's eye. right? But not everybody sees it that way. Sometimes people feel way more comfortable if they see themselves performing it on television. I'm making that great catch on television. So, and the reason that works is because we also have brain cells called mirror neurons that get that about seeing us perform. So sometimes that's why in physical education, when you see other kids perform a skill, other kids pick up on that. We pick up on that, and then we learn from them. So if we're watching a football game on TV and we say, "Hey, I could have done that," well, that's our mirror neurons saying, "Hey, you could do that. You've got that skill," and we make that connection. So that's another thing. That's a whole nother presentation. So um, the next part is, so you're looking, so if we're taking a set shot for an example, I would be in this position, and then I would see myself making the shot from my mind's eye. I would see it going up and in, and I'd get the feel of all of the skills that I would physically do to make sure that basketball goes into the hoop. Um, I need to be, it needs to be in real time. So I do lots of presentations for equestrian and rodeo. And so if you're a bull rider, you need to perfect your thinking in terms of 8 seconds, because that's how long you have to ride the bull, is 8 seconds. If you only do your mental imagery training for 6 seconds, well, you're gonna lose it in that competition. If you're running a race, you would need to think, and you'd have to perform your thinking in the exact time that it would take you to run that distance. So if you're running the 100-meter in 10.4 seconds, you must do your mental training and thought process in 10.4 seconds. So if you're skiing down a mountain and it takes you 90 seconds to get to the bottom, your mental imagery training would have to be for 90 seconds. It can't be longer, and it shouldn't be shorter. It needs to be realistic in terms of what your goal is. That's why writing the plan out is important to get to that point. So the next part is that, and this goes back to being in the position, but if I was at a track and field meet and I was running the 100 meters, it also helps when you do your mental training, when you're thinking about the race and everything going on, you would also need to involve all of the senses. So what would it feel like what does the track feel like? What does it smell like on a spring day when you're outside at a track and field venue? You can also go through different situations, because what if it's raining? What if it's windy? You can go through all of those. That's where the problem solving piece comes in. But you can always rehash or go through a situation in your mind before you actually get to it, and then you can make your corrections, and so that helps to really alleviate stress. But the more senses you can bring in, the better. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? All right. All of your senses. So obviously you're seeing, right? Touch, hearing, kinesthetic, all of your senses, bring all of them in, because that is really, really important. Because the greater or the more vivid you can create your imagery, the greater chances of a better blueprint being set down between your brain and your muscles, so that it can really make a difference and you can perform better. So real time and using as many senses as possible, being as creative and vivid in your imagery, is really, really important. Sometimes in training, for mental training, they actually really work on the vivid part first, so that people are drawing in all of these experiences, and that's very, very important moving forward. So um, so once we're in the position, okay, we're imagining the movement in our mind. Okay, so we're all set. We're bringing in everything. So after we've imagined doing it correctly, then we perform it. So in a set shot, I'm in this position, I see it in my mind, and now I shoot. So whenever you do mental training and then follow it with physical training, it enhances what you're doing. So that's a good thing. Now, if you're at home and you're not in that position where you're laying on a couch, well, of course you would just continue to review. But if you're in your situation, in your venue, that can be big, right? It'd be like in hockey goaltending. The goaltender would be in the crease in their ready position, review the skill, and then have a chance to physically do it, would make a big difference, right? Okay, so once you perform the skill, this is where coaches or teachers come into play. Now, with physical literacy and fundamental movement skills, this is big. So the child would imagine the skill, maybe standing on the beam, they're going to walk across it, so they're working on their balance, and then they would imagine it in their mind. Then they would actually physically perform it. Then they need feedback. Then they need feedback from themselves because they'll know if they did it well or not. Sometimes they won't, but most kids would say, okay, I didn't do that very well. Maybe they fell off the beam. But as they get back on, then that's when the teacher or the coach can say, these are the things that you need to do to make it better. Then you reimagine. Once you have feedback from yourself, somebody external, maybe a peer as well, but maybe you watched yourself on videotape and saw the mistake, you make the corrections then in your mind because you want that blueprint to be perfect, right? And then you take feedback and developing that blueprint takes time. Over a period of time, it takes lots of work, systematic and consistent. So you get feedback, then you go through the process again. Reimagine, do the imagery, mental imagery of the steps and the skills that you would need, and then repeat the process. So you would do it mentally again, and then you would practice it physically. Then you would do it mentally again until you get it perfect. And of course, this is a period of over a 6-month period of time. Some professional athletes are using this their whole career. So this is huge. So the earlier we can teach mental training to our kids, because physical literacy is a lifelong journey, then that skill stays with you all the time. I still use that skill in my opportunities for competitive sport. I'm kind of past that stage, but I can still use mental training to enhance everything that I'm doing, and it just makes life better. So that's a positive that way. So those are the steps. Those are the steps that are involved in where we're at. So here's a question that I get often, and it revolves around anxiety. So how can I mentally prepare if I've got butterflies, or if I'm and with young kids, this is really important. Like, how can I prepare myself to be optimally at my best when I go to compete? So here's a couple things to think about. Here's the first thing that we need to teach our kids along that journey. The first one is that all worry is needless. We need to tell ourselves that. Like, what taking action is important, but worrying about how you're going to do, or thinking, oh, I'm going to do poorly, isn't very good. We always have to be positive. We have to be positive because in our reptile brain, in our brainstem, way back, it was fight or flight. If you didn't respond well to a danger situation, you probably would die, and then that wasn't so good. So our brains, over a period of time or evolution, were like, hey, danger, danger. So our brains always default to the negative. Over a period of time in our lives, if we want to be successful, we need to change that. So every time we think of a negative thought, that we have to replace it with a positive. We have to stop and replace it with a positive. Because sometimes people will say, well, why does that happen to me? How come I always think negatively? That's called normal. We all do. Our brains always default to the negative, but very successful people tend to stop that and then always look at the positive, or change that negative thought into a positive one. When you do that, you tend to worry less, and then your anxiety goes down. So that's important. The other piece is that you want to be in that optimal zone of the optimal zone is really important of where you want to be. So what that means is that you don't want to be revved too high going into an activity or a competition or performing a skill, because then you won't perform your best. You sort of want to be calm and controlled in the middle, and then your performance level will be very, very high. If you're not mentally ready at all, you're not going to perform very well. But sometimes when you're in the zone, the optimal time, things tend to slow down. Everything falls into place. Mentally, you're thinking properly. Physically, you're performing properly. The game is going the way you want it to. The strategies that you're thinking are working. All of that is due to really, really good preparation. So when you want to decrease your anxiety, if you're really prepared, you will ultimately do better. And that's really important. And you won't be as anxious. Sometimes if you didn't study for the test, I'm kind of thinking you're going to be anxious and you probably won't do very well. But if you are really, really prepared and you've taken steps, your anxiety will decrease and you'll actually perform better. So, um, so, so how do we? So when it comes to physical literacy, let's talk about confidence, because we're looking at confidence, competence, and motivation. So that's a big deal, right? So confidence. So I'm going to go back to two skills when it comes to confidence. So the first one is that just fake it. Keep telling your brain that you're confident, you're ready, but good preparation makes you ready. So I'm going to be confident. And some kids have that very naturally, and others have to learn that. Sometimes as adults we have to learn that. So fake it till you make it. Be confident. And then my favorite story then goes back to the Wizard of Oz, right? So we have three characters, right? So the Tin Man is looking for a heart, the Scarecrow is looking for a brain, and the Lion is looking for courage, right? And ultimately, they all three had it. Even though they were looking for it, they already had it. They just didn't know that, right? So you need to be the lion in the Wizard of Oz. You have to fake it till you make it. The courage, it's there, and that's huge. So having the confidence to perform ultimately lends itself to then practicing properly mentally and physically, which gives you the competence, and then ultimately that leads itself to the motivation to perform well. And if we start to use that in all aspects of our lives, and if we can transfer that to the kids and athletes that we're teaching and coaching, that can really make a difference in their skill level. So that is really, really great. So I know that I've given you lots of information in a short period of time, but I think the effort you could make to do mental training to enhance fundamental movement skills and physical literacy can transfer to all aspects of your life and your students and athletes, and it can really make a difference. So I'm going to end off with a story, and I'll just get my ball glove here and a baseball. So it's a story of Mike Messina. He was a pitcher for the Baltimore Orioles, and I think he ended his career with the New York Yankees. But when when Mike was a little boy, grew up on a farm. His dad, on the barn door on the back of the barn, had painted the strike zone, and then moved back, had the pitcher's mound and a bucket of balls, and as a child, Mike would stand on the mound behind the barn, and he would throw a baseball with no catcher, but there would be the strike zone painted on the barn door, and that's how he learned how to pitch as a young boy. Then his career, he went through the different stages, getting up, moving to the different levels, finally getting to Major League Baseball, to the pros. And at times when he was a new pitcher in the pros, he really struggled hitting the strike zone. And there was a certain game where he was having trouble, and his pitching coach came out and talked to him during the break in the action as to where it was. As the coach is leaving the mound, his coach tells him that, Mike, throw to the barn door. So he's at the pro level, and his coach says throw to the barn door. For the rest of his career, a very successful career as a major league pitcher, Mike Messina would throw to the barn door at the pro level. So he went back to his thinking of all those pathways that had been set down when he was a little boy, and for the rest of his career then started to throw. Every time he looked at a major league batter, all he saw was the white strike zone that his dad had painted on the barn door, and that's what he threw to for the rest of his career. It's a fascinating story, and there's many of them in sport around that. But it's huge. made a really, really big difference. So I hope that this presentation has given you something to think about in terms of the advantages of using mental training. And I wish you all the best. I know that with the pandemic on right now, it's a great opportunity to use mental training, especially when you can't maybe physical train as much. This is a great skill that kids can use and athletes can use if they're injured. But it can also transfer to all aspects of your life and their lives, and it can really make a difference. Remember, quality time left. It's really important. We want to make sure that we're mindful in the moment, and that we can enjoy life to the fullest when we take that all in and we use it systematically and consistently. So thank you. Wishing you all the best.
Reg, the first question I'm going to ask is from Stacy. So she said, I'm curious about what imagery training would look like with our students in an average PE class, knowing that FMS development is a cornerstone in a child's physical literacy journey in the earliest of learning year. In addition, knowing that executive functioning skills have just begun to flourish, especially in the problem solving and critical thinking areas.
So my answer would be there is that we rarely, as physical educators, especially with young children, teach what I just talked about in terms of mental imagery training skills. So I think it's important to start talking to our students when they're younger, and let them know that improving your fundamental movement skills, or what we're trying to teach you in physical education, also has a big part to do with how we think. And actually have those conversations with our students while we're teaching physical education. And I think the earlier that they learn those skills, the better. Many of our very resilient students in physical education, if you interview them, have picked up some of those mental skills, that mental toughness or prowess piece. They actually were taught that or learned it very early on, and then have been able to apply that to all parts of their lives. So sometimes I think we have to actually be purposeful, because that's where it goes back to the plan. We actually need to write out and say, hey, I'm going to take some time in my physical education classes while I'm teaching these skills, and I'm going to talk about how we mentally can improve on that and make that part of our teaching. It's not going to happen in one lesson. It's not going to happen in a whole year, but over a period of time, if we systematically and consistently teach that, that's a good thing.
Okay, the second question we received is, how do you imagine some skill-ready position in the bedroom? For example, swimming or side volley or turning pose, or for swimming, the turning pose or triple jump. What is the pose that you start with? And if you imagine from the start block, that's easy. What about imagination of the moment of the jump? And what pose to start with in more complex situation or skill set?
Okay, so as skills get more complex, you have to remember that as you physically get better at your skill, and I think we're talking about kids that are, or athletes that are doing pretty well in their sport or their activity. You also have to up the ante then in terms of mental training. So as an example, as a goaltender, I was able to put myself mentally into all kinds of positions on the ice where I could actually do the training. I couldn't have done that when I was younger. I didn't have the background, right? In swimming, you would want those athletes to be able to really to start out by, in their training, and this would take a long time to do, but you'd want them to get all kinds of sort of that mental feel for what the water is like and the positions that their body would be in. Then they can automatically put themselves back into a position of, say, their race or the skill that they're doing. Equestrian riders will put themselves into a position mentally of somewhere along the course. They're not on their mount or whatever, but they're able, because they got so much mental training, they're able to put themselves back into a position of their course that they can figure out where they need to work on their skills and so on. Downhill skiers are also very good at that. They can put themselves on any place of the course in their mind because they've imagined that course millions of times over a period of time. But again, very systematically, very consistently. They didn't do it the night before. They really can put themselves back into those positions. So
Okay, and we have a really good question from Oscar, and he's asking about inclusion. So, have you used mental imagery training with physically disabled students?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we have to know that everybody's body works differently, right? So, but they can also put themselves into a position, even though they will kind of inherently know what the limitations are for what their skill development is. But if you come at it from a positive perspective, what have you got to lose? So rather than assuming that a child who maybe is physically awkward or handicapped and can't physically do some skills or is hurt, you still have the advantage of trying to teach mental imagery training so that what they're thinking then still translates into their physical bodies and to the neural pathways that they would be using. Um, of course, the body will limit what they can do, but you have nothing to lose but to teach the mental training skills to them, because you never know what they can enhance, right? Also, too, one thing about mental imagery training for all students is that you can be really successful and you can see yourself being successful in all kinds of skills. And if you do, whether you can do them or not, you're going to feel better about physical education and physical activity. And ultimately, that's all it's about. It's if I feel good about what I'm doing because I'm thinking positively, I might try it more, I might do it more. So that's an easy, that's a simple answer to a very complex situation. But never underestimate kids that, and we understand that some kids are are or have difficulty in terms of what they can do, but we all have these students now that sit on a bench and aren't engaged or not motivated to participate. That doesn't mean that they're not mentally involved in what's going on. So we sometimes forget that. Have you ever had a student where you taught the whole lesson and you were pretty sure the kid wasn't listening, and then you ask him 3 questions as he's leaving the class and he knows the answer to everything? So just because he didn't do the assignment doesn't mean that he wasn't learning. It's the invisible backpack, right? There's lots going on. So
And there's a tricky question for you, Reg. So, question regarding what you said about faking it until you make it. Because so this question goes, you can have confidence and still not be able to feel competent in movement. So how do you or how do you balance the confidence and also like the real confidence from knowing what to do, knowing the fundamental movement skills? How do you have that balance?
I think that's where really good communication comes into play. And I had talked about that area where, as a teacher or coach, you critique your athletes or your students in terms of what they're able to do. That's where that comes into play. We've all had those students in our class that are incredibly confident, but they can't catch anything, right? Now that's a lot better than somebody who has no confidence and can't catch. So I think we at least have a chance, and we can start in that area. So the confidence piece comes from that positive perspective that we can get to where we need to be. One thing about that situation though is that confident kids will definitely, like research proves this, confident kids will do way more reps in terms of a skill that you're trying to teach than a child who's unconfident. So we also have the advantage that we can use other venues to teach that skill, mainly being physical. But the confidence piece is pretty good. So
Okay, and last question. So should an individual trigger their other senses as well? The smells, the additional things that you may hear?
for sure, the more senses that you can incorporate, the better chance of the neural pathways that are being established between your brain and your muscles. So if you can incorporate all of them into it. So as an example, baseball pitchers will know exactly what it feels like as they hold a baseball with the different types of grips that they use in order to throw the ball. So it gets as you incorporate more of the senses, you also get a lot better at imagining environments, how your body feels when you do it. Those things are really, really important. So, and maybe going back to the other question about the confidence piece when you're teaching, that's where really, really good preparation takes place. So as an example, if I'm a, and this is a tough example, but if I'm a really, really good coach, say, and I'll use football as an example, as a football coach. If I'm really good at teaching students fundamental movement skill development, and using mental training to enhance their physical skills. If we don't train physically, if we don't do any fitness testing, or not fitness testing, but if we don't do any fitness training or strength training while we're playing football, we're also not going to be a very good team. So there's other variables that need to come into play. So does that mean that just using mental training or mental image training, it's just one tool of many that you're going to need. I still need to work on my flexibility. I still need to work on my strength. I still need to work on strategy. But mental training for strategy development is huge. And then mental training, teaching games for understanding, mental training just fits into that naturally. It's huge. So proper preparation in terms of all facets of what you're trying to do in terms of fundamental movement skill development, or say sport training or team training, are really important. So.